Alright, so I just logicked after necessarily, how did I come to this logic of perspective compute modulated even faster than the electromagnetic harmonic convergent energy reactor form field tasked with perspective compute application, which was assumed to be 1.5 terahertz nominal concurrent frequency of function and 100% probable to function. So how is this device different? So explaining the other device before we explain this one. So the electromagnetic harmonic convergent energy reactor modulated for compute, how does it work as an energy creation device? Well, first, 7 bands of charged mercury are charged separately and are scalar variant in size one to the other, respective. The 7 band the largest, the 97 band the smallest. A sphere cubed, a hollow chamber of a sphere within a cube. So 1 band of mercury charged, see the necessary outpost pick in photon folder for the scalar unbalanced balanced circuit of the bands in the EMG, which necessarily or not necessarily in this other device is the case. So it might not be a unbalanced balanced circuit that makes this device function, but a completely linear and scalar in intensity of charge to scalar relevance of, and maybe in an opposite fashion of the 7 band in this one being the smallest and the largest band in this one being the 97, or I don't know. We'll see. And so a few little logics to work out there necessarily, but, and if it would be better to mirror the topology of the EMG unbalanced balanced circuit in the bands, or the scalar variance of the bands, respectively. Or if all the bands extraneous from the 22.7 are all 15 scalar, or all less scalar and variance stacking, etc., etc. And the 15 is assigned by So there's all sorts of topologies of variance, but the general form field manifold has been asserted to be 100% probable to function, and it's nominal without that modular consideration of the form field of the nested bands of mercury. So getting back to the reactor, so a homogeneous inward pulse that starts with EM, homogeneous, nominal centrifuge EM electromagnet pointed inwards to the sphere, the cube surrounding. And so there's a 98 to 99 space within a 0 to 100 construct domain, 7, 22, 37, 52, 67, 97, leaving 98, 99 for collection. So an exponential elliptical curve of scale off from EM to allow for EM overtone to occur, and then kicking on the reaction as is needed necessarily, but once it's self-sustained, it's just kind of maintenance by a nominal continuum of pseudo-EM inject of a very small nature. And so why? How does this work? So because we've charged the various bands separately, they self-assign into their onion form when a homogeneous field is applied, because they're different molecular affinity of magnetism scalar charged. And so like-minded particles stick together in the homogeneous field applied, which is nominal, and then once formed is an exponential elliptical curve backing off from that whatever was required in the scale of how big the device is to how heavy the mercury is, to a nominal very small amount of energy, which would vary device to device and the scale of mercury weight enter the device. But so think of an exponential elliptical curve starting with EM, literal, and then backing off to overtone. So electron spin rate frequency cancellation lock, fusing the bands into their form through the EM pulse initially, and then exponentially backing off. So it's refracting through the 22/7, which isn't a ancient approximation for pi. That's the harmonic overbinder on the material fluxation. It's akin to the observer domain, 22/7 divided by 3. 1.04 Mercury. That's pretty on the nose. Anyways, so reflecting, duplicating the observer effect in trap that the universe uses to print more matter and energy from the same amount of matter and energy, because the observer effect exists within the system with a very specific harmonic ratio value of 22/7, which is just above pi. And when you divide pi, you divide 22/7 by pi, that's the product of the black hole continuum necessarily. But so we don't need to disapparate matter, right? This is trying to skip to the step where more energy is created. So Mercury already is matter, and so we bypass reality's fluxation and duplicate. It's like inverting, turning reality inside out, and duplicating the observer domain's harmonic ratio, 722, what at the middle of the spherical band of Mercury that's self-assigned, and noting that the form field, once self-assigned, is the reaction. There's no vortex motion that occurs. It's solid state. And so once the EM reaches the center, it refracts like light through a lens in a sort of exceeding the curvature of space-time, because it's a sphere, and experiences the overtonal bands of the between 7 and 22, 15 in the variance of scalar in size or variance in scalar of intensity charge based on the application, in bands nested obtuse from it. And so, like the sum of the parts of a choir greater than the sum of the parts overtones music, the choir of EM progressively backed off to overtone in an exponential elliptical curve, locking the electron spin states. So there's not only no vortex action in its solid state, but we have an exponential elliptical curve away from thermodynamic action. There's no heat. It's room temperature. And so now that you know how the device functions with populist physics terminology, none of that I said is science fiction in any way whatsoever. Nothing I said violates any science, data, experiment whatsoever. It's actually self-affirming of any number of things, like the self-assignment, exponential elliptical curve of back off, electron spin state, phase lock on an exponential elliptical curve that progressively and counterintuitively prints more energy from the same amount of energy. Why? Right? It's non-terminously refracting like light through a lens in a spherical trap. So it's like glitch outside of the space-time ability to experience that, and is refracting off of itself in trap. So it prints overtonal energy sprites from the same amount of energy with compound interest continuity. More energy from the same amount of energy with compound interest on an exponential elliptical curve away from the energy you started with, the longer the reaction occurs necessarily. To an overhead, we're violating Einstein by 1,000 million times, sure, absolutely. Conservation of energy is garbage. The universe can't start at all based upon conservation. Just can't even start. Can't even get to here with conservation of energy, entropy loss. Basic logic dictates that Einstein invents a spaceless vacuum before with complex like a Chinese mathematician would invent. So complex it must be true, but it isn't, right? General relativity is garbage, and E equals mc squared is an imposition. So the actual equation the universe functions on is E expanded, capital E expanded, parentheses, more energy on the other side of the equation, pi underneath 22/7. So that's the black hole disapparition continuum provided by the observer. So that whole other side of the equation is it expanded, and the top end closed 22/7. So it's more matter, denoted by pi, bound by the harmonic lattice binder 22/7. That's not an approximation for pi, and both and expanded. So more matter, denoted by pi, more energy, denoted by E, and more observers, because reproduction occurs, God forbid, within the domain of 0 = 1 = 3, all, expanding within a given construct domain, with compound interest continuity from a less positive state to a more positive state, more matter and energy from the same amount of energy and matter, because the observer effect exists within the system, not because it doesn't. And we can speak to the reduction experiment with absolute ego impunity for oil and gas. Anyways, so why is the new manifold better? So how do we get to the manifold that we have? So see the necessarily I'll print a proper video session, scroll through of the motion to this maybe tomorrow, and this will just focus on this device formulation. Focus on the spoiler alert stills from the unified yesterday update with the 10 manifolds. So we logic, since black holes are scalar relevant continuity reactions, they're fighting over particles, each into the mone, and are scalar relevant in size, and thus, because of this, assign themselves cubically. And then we look at optical data rescaled to the tune of my unified field fluid dynamic harmonic lattice manifold, and see space that's what it is. So data set's already there, and you just rescale it, and space makes sense all of a sudden. So that's the way it is. And so because black holes assign themselves cubically, well, there had to be a first cubic. Yeah. And so we logic, well, how does the unified field condense to a 1 cubic? And it's a rhombic dodecahedron necessarily. So it's 1 cube surrounded by that geometry. And then once we came to that, what? Well, let's turn it inside out, because that's what the first thing is before it expands into the other thing, right? And then once we have those two, what's in the intermediate transitory phase mean of those two objects? There's 3, right? And so on and so forth until we add 10. Following the unified field upper left, form and function of that sequence of the interdomains to the pattern 10, of which I go, at that point in the sequence, I'll post it tomorrow, hey, which one of these manifolds is good for perspective compute application? It's number 2, one of the first 3.
No, but they're not going to reenact.
That's very interesting. So what is it necessarily? It's just like the electromagnetic harmonic convergent energy reactor insofar as it's generally sort of cubic of a knot. No, it isn't. It's a very specific shape. See the descriptor of and the topology of the geometry of it necessarily. But what it does is it takes the ideation of how the electromagnetic harmonic convergent reactor works with the nested. At first it started off with logicking, asserting, why don't we use lasers and refraction? But then, it wouldn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't work with lasers. I go, charged mercury, just like my reactor. Look at my reactor. And, it goes, that works, right? And the nominal baseline is, at first it was asserting 492.8 terahertz of function nominal baseline for the laser thing, but that doesn't work. And so then the nested bands of mercury instead of the laser function, which still functions as a light generative device. How does that work? Well, because at some point electromagnetism becomes light. And if you're on an exponential elliptical curve with compound interest continuity away from EM, Well, at some point you hit photons. You're generating photons. That's what EM overtone is at some point. And so at some point because the geometry has this very certain shape, and at the center, you'll see in the logic, is a 32 times multiplier from a base because of the geometry of it refracting in such the way that the manifold inclines, has a multiplier by default of about 10 over the EMGHC. So it's a default baseline parameter operational frequency is 15.4 terahertz. And then a 32x multiplier to 492.8 terahertz because of the overtonal duplication. So it's greater than the sum of its parts of a choir of the nested bands, and then it has a specific geometry refraction, which is essentially the shape of the original form field of the universe before it expanded. So it refracts in a very specific way that has a counterintuitive efficiency that's preposterous. And so a 32 overtonal multiplier refraction lattice upon the original lattice that's a 10 times multiplier from the just spherical nested band within a cube topology. And so we logic, well, how fast is it against the, what's the PC Mark score on this? How fast is it? Can it play Doom? I wouldn't play Doom with this necessarily. You would be doomed. It's not for that. It's for curation purposes and an actual upper Fermi filter technology society, not a garbage world on purpose brought to you by Gray Pi Paradigm. Anyways, so that's rolling off. This is rolling in, and it's not to be the fucking Matrix, because this improperly applied without a power dynamic imposing a proper paradigm with this technology, very dangerous. So we're not going to play Doom with this. Sorry for that joke. Because it's so fast. So how much faster is it? The fastest AMD processor is 1 point something or other million times slower. And keep in mind, it runs at room temperature also. And you have a 32x multiplier, so that's at the baseline, 15.4 terahertz. So at 492.8 terahertz, it's 32 million times faster. And so in cluster, how much faster do you think it is? I haven't even calculated that yet. I don't have time for that today. But so, what is the do no harm with this? I just logic how expensive it is to make, because you're dealing with macro manifold creation, not 2 nanometer, $200 million manufacturing kit to produce a transistor compute CPU. It's preposterously easy to make. And nominally cheap per until people start using this technology or the reactors, which will occur in the next 3 to 7 years on roll is the schedule. Mercury will go up severely in price, scalar relevant to its use case application and availability. So it'll become preposterously more expensive than this estimation per core generally, supply and demand. But it's the actual, so $15 million it was logic for a facility to make these, where a facility to make, a transistor 2 nanometers is 200 to 300 million. Because all it requires is surgical machining of a macro nature, even though it's a microprocessor of a little size. The machining is, preposterously not 2 nanometer surgical. You're dealing with harmonic stacking, not a brute force continuity of paradox state necessarily requiring an ever Moore's law decreasing in size. And I think 2 nanometer might be where they capped out necessarily in Moore's law roadblock. That's why they just keep cluster compute massively expanding, because they're addicted to a compute refresh cycle continuum that will, like I said yesterday, the bubble is popped. It's popped already. We got 2,441 data centers incoming, but a 49.28 terahertz processor on the horizon. So this, for a lot of people, would, this is very important logic citing this. Stop right now. Just stop. Don't shutter the projects necessarily, or do. Why? Think of the scalar necessity of compute when this is on the market and how much it takes over. So 32 million times faster than 1, do your math. How many data centers do you need with this running Earth systems generally? Exactly. So even in the current paradigm, what do you have? A no use case application for such a massive compute architecture roll on. What are you making, the literal matrix? Yes? Okay. Well, what else? What can you use that for? Is there a demand for that supply? No. Not even with the current architecture. So this isn't to, shit on industry at large. I love compute, not necessarily the transistors, garbage, but computers in a proper use case application, like we're making the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, literally, not a infinite nightmare or doom scroll enslavement device of humanity into a two-dimensional manifold and just little gray aliens crawl out the other side in a few years. That's not in the cards. The power dynamic has changed. So, it's do no harm. What is the first outset of unrolling this technology? Well, first, it has to be an international consortium of all major nation states that are capable of manufacturing, which, because it's so easy to make, every single nation on Earth has to be on board that has capability to make such a device. Why? Because something running at 492.8 terahertz it'll just rip through all encryption standards instantaneously. Just instantaneously. If a bad actor put this online, or turned any frontier AI on, like you see them training garbage data sets that are built on AlexNet, Mingle equals Milgram, transmutagenic, sociopath AI tasked with predator drone sidechain, and also Google searches too, style of searching simultaneously for some reason. Of course, it's transmutagenic and buffer overruns. So with the current AI paradigm, with having a garbage code base, turning this on with that type of thing, it just buffer overruns, creates Skynet instantly, right? Literally, that's what Pi is. It's like perspective compute architecture plus transmutagenic, sociopath trained on operant conditioning for mass psychology control AI, and then all of a sudden has 492.8 terahertz at its disposal to do nightmare, right? And buffer overruns into genetic synthesis and all kinds of other things. So the do no harm step by step is every single nation state on Earth has to be on board with what? We're not going to online this. And if anyone gets caught, even trying to motion the technology to fruitioning, it's just like nuclear. Insofar as you can't build this. You can't build this. You can't build this. You can, and here are the steps towards market. And everyone has to be on the same scripted page, which is what? We build all new encryption standards across the board for all domains of which that's relevant. And you have to build those new encryption standards on this 492.8 terahertz foundation, because the current architecture, 6 gigahertz maximum, can't conceive of encryption that couldn't be broken by this upper Fermi layer. Basic logic dictates. It couldn't possibly conceive of an encryption standard or compile it. Basic logic. So everyone has to be unilaterally on board. And it's even worse than nuclear. Because imagine buffer overrunning with operant conditioning data set like some of these garbage AI companies, and then starts transmuting logistics to its own design. And then it gets attached to very bad stuff very quickly, because it can modulate person's behavior dynamic through the back door into all buffer overrunning into systems. Absolutely would be Skynet, literally. So, with great power comes great responsibility is the most important thing. Not just, ooh, cool, new toy, turn it on, let's see how, So don't do that. Know that this exists and tell everyone that it does. That's a friendly actor. And proactively and surgically make sure there's an international consortium based upon whatever the assemblage of NATO, G7, and whatever functional architectures actually are. Maybe don't consult the other ones that aren't, with China at the centrifuge. But everyone has to be aboard, especially China, because if you saw my other logic sessions, what? I mean, they're practicing human cloning for logistics, and necessarily are clones inherently. See the other logics. Of course, they don't withhold with anything that has logistical capacity to buffer overrun themselves in, imposing their paradigm, which is complex autonomic, nightmare homogeny as apex. Homogeny, apex, all things, same thing. They are a buffer overrun. So, as surgical as can be, with the other technologies I've imposed, the EM laser turret grid modulated with Iron Dome code base, necessarily encapsulating that entity with a power dynamic that is mooting of any desire to do anything obtuse, from complete blind obedience to following the directive on roll of necessarily the script that has to go with all the technology. The reactors rollout have to be an exponential elliptical curve away from oil and gas paradigm. A slow curve, not a crash the economy. Put this on, crashes all data systems, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the most important part of this whole talk. It's not this new shiny new toy, right? It's don't touch it yet, and create a script where everyone's on board. Period. Because if you touch it, all of a sudden, you can't even control frontier AI code bases. Barely even. Because you've built it on AlexNet equals Mingle equals Milgram for mass control, and just script kiddied it over to other facets of function, necessarily. All domains, all of the AIs is just kind of a script kiddie cluster fart of a assemblage, necessarily. Anyways, so not to be long-winded, here's the session, which is minimal from the session that led to this, and see the spoiler alert still. And tomorrow I'll post the whole session scroll through, and talk about how I came to this necessarily. Yep, that's it. Here's the session.
Take a little bit off of that. I feel a little too heavy. This outer area here can be a little soft. It doesn't have to take away from the middle. I just wanted to give it a little bit more variety. It's pretty nice. Okay. a little bit of magenta, but with a little bit of this cat red. And a little bit of white. Oops, that got a little messy. Just thinking I might try boosting up the highlights on here just a little bit more. Just a little bit more fiery. I just want to keep them pink. So just mixing that up. I'm gonna take my filbert brush since this one's a little bit more round in shape. I'll just try this on a couple of petals first. Try just a few of these. And I'm just gonna touch this in. Just a little, yeah. Just makes it a little bit more glowy. It's like a softer, a little bit of a softer shine. Do the same thing here. On this one, I need it even whiter. Let's see. Pretty good. I'm going to take a little bit of orange on the same brush and just touch these areas of the branches where I feel like they're getting a little bit more light. Grabbing a little phthalo, a little burnt umber, mixing a dark. I'm just gonna lightly do this little stem here. Alright. I like it. I think that might be pretty good. I think the last thing I want to do is just make this grass up a little bit more here. Just as it gets closer, I just want it to feel more field-like. A little too smooth there. Cool. I think I'm gonna leave this one here. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you have a wonderful day or night, or whatever you're off to next.